Why review the methodology? Because the methodology has answers. So, for example, for gas stations, there are different processes, and you need to calculate the emissions for these different processes. Each operation needs to be included as a different process in TEISS, and what's important is that you understand how these were calculated, because, for example, if you use data from perhaps the state that was calculated using an EPA model to calculate on-road emissions, you need to make sure that the vehicle refueling emissions are not double counted, because you can see they're already counted here as part of the gas station emissions. Typical errors in emissions inventories: missing or duplicate facilities, getting the facility location wrong, missing operating or technical data that's needed to do the calculations, or just wrong data, double counting, mistakes in calculations, and then data entry or transposition errors where you switch a 8 and a 6, for example, and data coding errors, looking at the different codes for the different facilities. The most typical quality control error is letting it slide. Make sure to build in time for QA/QC. Make sure that you are doing it right instead of just getting it done. So if you get it done, it may turn out that you actually have to go back and redo some of your work. And it's a good idea just at the start to allot perhaps 4 hours a week for quality control. Then if you determine that you don't need to spend that much time at it, then you can cut it down a bit, but build it into your planning because it is going to take time. So you need to have adequate documentation so that you are sure that your eventual report reflects the effort that you put into this inventory. You need to be able to have documentation in case there's an assessment of your inventory to ensure reproducibility of the estimates that you calculate. If somebody else could look through your logbook and get the information, could they come up with the same numbers? And then, most importantly, a foundation for future inventories is going to look at the quality of these estimates. So quality assurance is independent review by a third party. For example, ITEP can help you review your project in TEISS as well as your written emissions inventory report. Quality assurance is stepping back and looking at the effort that you put into quality control. Was it effective? In general, 10% of project resources should be allotted to quality assurance. That is just a general guideline. It may be that you need to spend more time at the beginning really looking at what sort of inventory you need to write. Look at your sources, look at the time that you have. Don't wait until the end. And the idea is that this QA person, the data reviewer, will check some of the data entry, some of the calculations, some of the documentation, and then if any errors are found, alert you, and perhaps in collaboration with you, go back and try to fix those errors while you still have time and you still have the information available to you. What is a quality assurance project plan? It is a tool for you, and this may be also you, the planners, to document the type and quality of information needed for environmental decisions. Keep in mind that the signatures on the QAPP commit to doing what it says. So it's a good idea to get signatures on your QAPP and make sure that people read it and understand what their signatures imply. It describes the methods, just the requirements, not necessarily detail about the methods, but the requirements that you're going to have for your data recording when you collect data and when you assess the information that you gather. And last but not least, it's required by EPA. So why is it important? Well, it's an agreement that documents everybody's decisions about who is going to do what and when. And this documentation is very important. It sets the goals and objectives for the project, and it does provide a roadmap of how you're going to conduct your emissions inventory in a way that adheres to the requirements that you've set up for the quality of your data. And it provides long-term guidance. So if somebody needs to finish this project, if you get called away or promoted, or for future emissions inventories, it's really important that a QAPP be in place. And it also makes writing the emissions inventory report a lot easier because you have these requirements for the quality of your data documented in your QAPP. The TEISS Inventory Preparation Plan Wizard is a wizard that walks you through something similar to TurboQAPP, for those of you who are familiar with it. and it walks you through documenting your emissions inventory in the inventory preparation plan format. Unfortunately, this is not in the same format as a QAPP. However, the IPP does help you in terms of providing a place where you can put together all this documentation, and you can use the IPP throughout your emissions inventory data gathering and calculations to document what you do. It's just another place where you can document what you do in TEISS. So once you click on the wizard, it opens up a menu similar to in TurboQAPP, where you can, once you go through the first introductory screens, you can click on these various headings and jump to those. If, for example, you are going to look at QA/QC, for example, you can jump around using this navigation tree. It's important that you understand the uses to which your emissions inventory is going to be put. It's the foundation for your air quality program planning. And these people at Navajo Nation EPA prepared an emissions inventory as one of the first steps towards deciding what monitoring needs to be done. It's important to document the baseline, so as your sources perhaps expand or new development comes onto the reservation, what emissions do they emit, and how do they compare with the emissions that you calculated based upon the sources that exist now. It's a necessary component for developing a permitting program. It is important if you're moving towards a tribal implementation plan, and it's important if you participate in regional air quality planning efforts to have an emissions inventory report as the foundation of your program. So start with the quality assurance project plan, go through the steps that we've laid out for you following the example that we have. Keep in mind that the level 4 emissions inventory that you've been working on can be the off-reservation section of your level 1, 2, or 3 EI, but the data from off-reservation sources need to be in a separate section. So you need to make sure to have those in separate sections and you don't add their emissions together. This is an example of a quality assurance project plan table looking at the data source types. So, for example, this table from Colville, thank you, Chris Ray, lists the facility names, the address, and then the type of source. And this is important for you as you begin your planning and you're looking at perhaps how you're going to group sources together and what information you're going to have to gather from them. Now, whenever there's a permit involved at a facility, you generally can get that information from EPA and often even just from the EPA regional website. And that's great information because they've already calculated the estimated emissions. So looking at the information that you're going to have to gather, this is a screenshot of a blank calculator from TEISS. And you can see that this is really useful information and shows you what sort of information you're going to have to gather from the source. So we highly recommend looking at these ahead of time and figuring out what the different terms mean. Data quality objective. Data quality objectives are general statements. So they're statements pretty much along the line of we are going to be as accurate as possible and we're going to do that by X, Y, and Z. Completeness, we're going to go for 100% of our Title V sources, for example. In this case, for the off-reservation section, for example, we're going to say we're going to download all the point and non-point NEI data, that's from EPA's National Emissions Inventory Database, for the area of concern, which is our buffer zone. So that's the completeness for the sources in the buffer zone. Data quality indicators, those are more specific measures of progress towards each objective. When we're monitoring air quality, we think of these as like data quality objective, meaning that's your objective for precision. The data quality indicator is how well did I do towards that objective. So again, an example of completeness would be 100% of the Title V sources in the buffer zone, for example. And this is an example from an approved quality assurance project plan for the objective of accuracy and then the data quality indicator of accuracy. So how are you going to measure how close you got to this objective? So it lists the procedure saying that we're going to use TEISS and the GIS portion of TEISS to look at the proportion of the source on tribal land, and then we will scale down the emissions using Excel, and we're going to start off with the NEI data that was estimated using AP42 emission factors. And then somebody else is going to review what proportion of those emissions are actually on tribal land. That's our procedure. And then how are we going to measure how close we got to that with the data quality indicator? Well, for emissions inventories, you have to be a little bit more vague than you do for other types of projects when you're actually gathering, for example, air quality data in parts per million. You say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to thoroughly document all our sources sufficiently so that an outside reviewer could repeat all the calculations and come up with the same numbers. We're going to use TEISS's QA/QC notes field, and we're going to make sure that we identify all the sources of information in the final emissions inventory report. We're going to use standard methods, meaning AP42, which are in TEISS, and the methods used will be documented. So it's not something that we could say, oh, well, we're plus or minus 14%. This is different. We have to be more qualitative and say, this is how we're going to assess whether we got close to this objective of accuracy. And all of this is in the example quality assurance project plan for you to review and use if it's appropriate for you. So in the QA/QC section of your QAPP, you need to describe the requirements for how the data are collected, documented, checked, where the data are stored and backed up, and how the data will be reported. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be a few sentences at most. Type what makes sense to you that you can do. So for example, data management and reporting. Again, just 1 to 2 sentences each, saying how the data is going to be stored. Well, in TEISS, and you're going to have a paper filing system and an electronic filing system. You're going to, any information on paper, you're going to keep in your logbook or perhaps in a binder, and calculations done in spreadsheets, you're going to carefully name those. You may want to include your file naming convention in your QAPP and specify you're going to have all these sort of spreadsheets in a folder, and you're going to back up that folder, perhaps even nightly at the beginning. The final products of your emissions inventory, the completed TEISS project will have all the details, and that's the TEISS project. So that database that TEISS creates as you work through it will have all the details, especially if you fill in information using the QA/QC notes fields. The paper report will give general details and summarize results. And the presentation, if that's going to be one of your final products, will summarize results, and that presentation may be a executive summary to the emissions inventory or a presentation that you do to your department, for example. So just get it over with. I love this acronym because I use that a lot myself. Do your homework now. Pretty much for everything, the longer you wait, the harder it gets because it's harder to remember what we discussed today. And we look forward to receiving your draft quality assurance project plans for your level 2 or 3 emissions inventory.